Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the next episode of the Fresh Catholic Lenten series. I'm Charles Merritt. Good to be back with you. If you've been following along with us, you know that we here at Fresh Catholic, we're taking a little different approach to our Lenten series in that we're not talking about Lent in particular, the 3 Lenten practices, prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. What we're doing is we're getting in a time machine, and we're going back 2,000 years to 33 AD to the original Holy Week, and we're going through each of the days of the original Holy Week, learning what happened on each of those days. A reason being that is that when we come to Holy Week 2025, as we go through each of those days in this year's Holy Week, we can kind of reflect back on what happened on each of those days in the original Holy Week, and we can enter into each day of Holy Week 2025 maybe a little deeper and a little more profoundly than we have in the past. So that's kind of the goal, that's kind of the expectation that we're approaching our Lenten series with. And last episode, we finished off Holy Thursday. So this episode and the next episode, we'll be talking about Good Friday. Now again, if you've been with us all along, you know that by and large, we're devoting one episode for each day. 2 exceptions to that. Holy Thursday had 2 episodes. Good Friday will have 2 episodes because so much happened on Holy Thursday and Good Friday that we want to stretch those days over 2 episodes. So just as we called it Holy Thursday Part 1 and Holy Thursday Part 2, likewise, we'll call our 2 episodes covering Good Friday Part 1, which is this episode, and Good Friday Part 2, which will be the next episode. Once we get through these next 2 episodes of Good Friday, we'll have 1 episode remaining, and that will be Holy Saturday. And if you're saying, Holy Saturday, did anything even go on during Holy Saturday? The answer is yes. A huge thing went on Holy Saturday. And if you were one of the people that were the recipient of this huge thing, you were ecstatic because you've been waiting for this huge thing seemingly forever. So yes, Holy Saturday, something very significant happened, and in our final episode of this series, we'll talk about what exactly that was. Now, the other question you might be saying, well, wait a second, Charles, you're saying that our Lenten series will finish up with Holy Saturday. Oh, what about Easter Sunday? Well, actually, Holy Week does not include Easter Sunday. Holy Week is from Palm Sunday to Holy Saturday. Easter Sunday starts the Easter season. Just like Christmas Day isn't part of Advent, it starts the Christmas season. Easter Sunday is not part of Lent, it starts the Easter season. So we won't be covering Easter Sunday in this Lenten series. However, a little teaser, I will be doing an Easter Sunday one-off talk where we'll talk about the resurrection and the significance of that. So with all of that as background, just to kind of reorient ourselves, this episode, we start Good Friday. Next episode, we finish it. So as we come into this episode, we've done Holy Thursday, right? We talked about the preparations for the Last Supper. We've talked about all the things that went on in the upper room Holy Thursday night, the foot washing, the Last Supper itself, which was a Passover meal, the institution of 2 sacraments, the sacrament of Holy Orders and the sacrament of the Eucharist, which Jesus instituted in that upper room Holy Thursday night. Then we follow Jesus and the disciples out of the upper room, down into the Kidron Valley, back up to the Mount of Olives, and into the Garden of Gethsemane. And we talked about why the Mount of Olives is called the Mount of Olives, and we talked about why the Garden of Gethsemane is called the Garden of Gethsemane. And then when we entered that garden, we talked about Jesus' agony and his arrest. Then what we did is we followed a bound Jesus out of the Garden of Gethsemane, back down the Mount of Olives, back across the Kidron Valley, and back up into Jerusalem to undergo the 3 Jewish trials. The first one in front of the former high priest Annas, the second one in front of the current high priest Caiaphas, and the final one at the crack of dawn, Good Friday morning, in front of the entire Sanhedrin. And it was there, in front of the entire Sanhedrin, basically the Jewish Supreme Court, if you will, that the official charge of blasphemy was formalized. And blasphemy being a capital offense, it subjects Jesus to capital punishment, the death penalty, which is what the Jewish religious leaders wanted all along. So the last time we talked, that's where we left it. It was the crack of dawn, Good Friday morning. Jesus, over the period of late Thursday night, all through the early hours of Thursday, late Thursday night into Friday, he's undergoing those 3 Jewish trials. We are now at daybreak, Good Friday morning. The Sanhedrin has convened. They have formalized the charge of blasphemy. Now, I indicated last episode that if this, in fact, was what the Jewish religious leaders wanted, they wanted to have Jesus killed, so they had to hang a charge on him that would subject him to the death penalty. They have just accomplished that. They have charged him officially with blasphemy. That is a death penalty charge. So I indicated last episode, you would think, okay, we then go from the Sanhedrin right to Calvary because they've got their death penalty charge, right? Not the case, because we got to remind ourselves that we're under Roman rule. And Rome, only Rome, had the authorization and the ability to execute. So they've got their death penalty charge, blasphemy, but they've got to have Rome, in the person of Pilate, sign off on it, because Rome authorized the execution and Rome carried out the execution. So we can't go from the Sanhedrin to Calvary. We've got to go through Rome and Pilate to get there, so to speak. So as we pick up this episode, it is daybreak, Good Friday morning. They are going to lead Jesus, still bound, from the Sanhedrin to Pilate's residence, where he will undergo the 3 Roman trials. That will be the main subject of this episode, those 3 Roman trials. And then next episode, Good Friday Part 2, we'll talk about the scourging, the crucifixion, and the burial. So that's kind of where we've been and where we are and where we're going to go. So let's pick up the narrative, so to speak. Let's kind of get back into that time machine, go back those 2,000 years to 33 A.D. It's daybreak, Good Friday morning. Jesus is being led to Pilate's residence. Now, a couple of things to put things in context. We said that in the Jewish religious calendar, there are 7 feast days. 3 of those are what are called pilgrim feasts. So named because you had to make a pilgrimage, you had to go to Jerusalem to celebrate them at the temple. Passover, which is the feast, the current feast, that's one of the 3 pilgrim feasts. So you had tons of people descending on Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Now, what Rome would do is the individual, the governor of this region, the procurator of this region, who was Pilate, every Passover, he would take up temporary residence in Jerusalem for the length of the feast. And he would bring in some extra Roman soldiers, because there were so many people descending on Jerusalem at the Passover that one of the main jobs of a Roman procurator, in addition to collecting the taxes for Caesar, is keeping the peace. So with so many people descending on Jerusalem, Pilate would take up temporary residence there. He would bring in extra soldiers to make sure the peace was kept, because that was big on his job description. So Pilate didn't live in Jerusalem full time. He just was there during these 3 pilgrim feasts. Now, his temporary residence was called the Praetorium. So when Jesus is led from the Sanhedrin to Pilate, they lead him to Pilate's temporary residence, which is the praetorium, okay? Now, when they arrive at the praetorium, very interesting. Scripture tells us that they arrive at Pilate's place, right? Because they've got to get him to sign off on the death penalty charge so they can get Jesus executed. They arrive at Pilate's place, but they refuse to go into Pilate's residence. Pilate is forced to come outside and meet with him outside. Why is this the case? Well, this is the Passover. Pilate is a pagan. If the Jewish religious leaders were to enter Pilate's temporary residence, they would become defiled, and they would be unable to celebrate the Passover. So rather than risking becoming defiled by entering Pilate's residence, Pilate has to go out and meet them. And look at the sad irony there. Here you've got a group of individuals, the Jewish religious leaders, right? They have, in essence, manufactured a charge of blasphemy on Jesus to get him killed. They have no compunction doing that, but they don't want to enter Pilate's residence because they might become defiled and unable to celebrate the Passover. So you want to know how far afield the Jewish religious leaders are at this point spiritually? That's a good indicator of it. They're more worried about becoming defiled if they enter Pilate's residence, when at the same time they're trying to execute Jesus. You know, a sad, sad irony. So at any rate, Pilate comes out to meet with them, right? Now, I want you to keep two things in the back of your mind as we go through these three Roman trials. Note to yourself how many times Pilate comes out and goes back in, comes out and goes back in. He does that a number of times. Why do I bring that up? Because Pilate, as we're going to find out, a number of times he declares that he finds Jesus innocent of the charges. A number of times Pilate indicates he thinks Jesus is innocent, right? So in Pilate physically going outside and back inside, back and forth, it's kind of like, in a way, a metaphor for Pilate trying to figure out, okay, how do I get out of this situation? I've got what I think is an innocent man, and I've got people and a crowd that want him executed. So how do I get out of this situation? He's going back and forth in his own mind how to do that, and the back and forth that he's doing physically, outside and inside, is kind of a physical metaphor for the back and forth he's going through mentally in trying to extract himself from this Jesus situation. The other thing that we want to keep in mind as we go through the Jewish trials is how the Jewish religious leaders just track just the cards they play, getting what they want. Now, what they want ultimately, like we mentioned, is Pilate signing off on the death penalty for Jesus. So as we go through these Roman trials, note how many different cards the Jewish religious leaders have to play before they get to their final card, their ace in the hole. So keep those two kind of things in the background as we go through the three Roman trials. So let's pick up the narrative, right? And again, I'm pulling from all the different Gospels to put this together. Jesus has arrived, the Jewish religious leaders have arrived with Jesus in tow at the Praetorium, Pilate's temporary residence. They can't go in for risk of being defiled. Pilate comes out. So let's pick up the narrative, right? Now, Pilate, say what you will about Rome, but they were a nation of law. They prided themselves on the rule of law. So the first thing Pilate has to do, the first thing Pilate does is he says, basically, what charge do you bring against this man? He wants to know what the charges are because Rome is a nation of laws, okay? And if you're bringing a criminal, supposedly an alleged criminal, in front of him for the purpose of him rendering a death penalty verdict, law indicates you have to state the charges. That's why Pilate starts off this back and forth between he and the Jewish religious leaders by saying, okay, what are the charges? What charge do you bring against this man? Now, how did Jewish religious leaders respond? They basically say, look, Pilate, if he didn't commit a crime, we wouldn't be here. That's their first response. Pilate asks them for the charge. They respond, look, Pilate, we wouldn't be here at daybreak on Friday morning if this guy didn't commit a crime. Sort of like a Pilate, trust us, okay? This guy's a bad dude. You don't want him walking around the streets of Jerusalem. Well, how does Pilate respond to that? Well, trust us, Pilate, is not an official charge. So that doesn't move Pilate at all, right? So he basically doesn't move off his position. So the Jewish religious leaders go, okay, that didn't exactly work. Now let's play our next card, okay? The Jewish religious leaders respond, well, we have a law, and our law says this man should be killed. We have a law, and our law says this man should be killed. Pause button. What law are they referring to when they say we have a law? They're referring to Leviticus 24:16, which indicates if a person commits blasphemy, which at this point is the charge, remember, if a person commits blasphemy, he is to be killed. That's the law they're referring to when they say we have a law, and according to this law, he must be killed. Leviticus 24:16. So the Jewish religious leaders playing their second card up the ante a little bit, okay? How does Pilate respond? Now again, Pilate, say what you will about him being a weak-willed man, okay? You don't get to be governor of a region. You don't get to be procurator of a region without having some smarts, without having something on the ball, right? So when the Jewish religious leaders say, well, we have a law, and according to our law, he must be killed, now Pilate says, okay, here's my first escape clause, if you will. Here's the first chance I have to get out of this situation. Because look at how Pilate responds. He says, well, in essence, he says, well, if you have a law and he's broken your law, then you deal with him. Beautiful response by Pilate, right? All right. Now the Jewish religious leaders are getting a little bit more nervous. They're saying, okay, we've played two cards now to try and get Pilate to sign off on this death penalty charge. Card number one, trust us, Pilate. We wouldn't have brought him here at daybreak if he didn't do something wrong. That got nowhere with Pilate. Card number two, well, we have a law, and our law says he's got to be killed. That gets nowhere with Pilate. In fact, okay, now Pilate has a little bit of the upper hand, right? Because he says, hey, if you have a law, judge him yourselves. So Pilate basically figures, okay, I've washed my hands of this situation. Well, the Jewish religious leaders are not exactly going to tuck their tails between their legs and go home, all right? They've got a number of different cards to play, which I indicated, right? So here's their third card. They up the ante a little bit more. They say, well, this guy Jesus, he's been going around, all right, and and look at the list of things they tack onto Jesus. He's been going around claiming to be a king, subverting the nation, telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar, which he didn't do, stirring up the people, claiming to be king, subversion, telling people not to pay taxes, stirring up the people, okay? You're talking treasonous language here, okay? Now, They're hoping that this perks up Pilate's ears a little bit. Because remember, okay, if you're saying this guy's going around subverting the nation, telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar, stirring them up, potentially causing an insurrection, claiming to be king, if you're Pilate, you got to take that seriously, right? Because if you don't, your job may be on the line, and more than that, your life might be on the line because you've got to protect Caesar, okay? So when the Jewish religious leaders respond by saying Jesus is going around the countryside doing all these things and saying all these things, now, A, they're getting a little bit more specific, and B, they've upped the ante tremendously, right? Now, Pilate, upon hearing this response, there's one part of this response by the Jewish religious leaders that Pilate takes note of. And this one part of this response of the Jewish religious leaders is going to set the tone for the rest of the Roman trials, and it's going to also set the tone for what Pilate puts on that placard over the cross. Let me read the list of activities the Jewish religious leaders claim Jesus is doing. He's claiming to be king. He's subverting the nation. He's telling people not to pay their taxes. He's stirring up the people. Now, if you're a Pilate, you're hearing this laundry list of things, and when the Jewish religious leaders say he's claiming to be a king, that word, king, is ringing in your ears. Because there is one, if you're a Pilate, there's one king, and that's Caesar. And if somebody else is claiming to be king, that's treason. Because they're thinking of overthrowing Caesar. So when the Jewish religious leaders say he's claiming to be king, now all of a sudden Pilate realizes, uh-oh, in some form or fashion, I'm going to have to deal with this. Because if I let this person go, who's claiming to be king, okay, again, my job and my life might be on the line because I've got to protect Caesar. That's why Pilate utters the first of a couple of his famous phrases. At this point, because remember, the Jewish religious leaders have Jesus with them. They're talking with Pilate outside the front door of his temporary residence, right? So Jesus is there when the Jewish religious leaders and Pilate are having this initial exchange. That's when Pilate turns to Jesus and says, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Now, we know that's one of the famous phrases Pilate has, "Are you the King of the Jews?" What we often don't know is the context within which he utters that phrase and the lead up to it. Now we know that, okay? Because the Jewish religious leaders are trying to get Pilate to sign off on a death penalty charge. They figure it's going to be easy. Trust us, Pilate. Pilate doesn't go for that. We have a law, Pilate. Pilate doesn't go for that. Now the Jewish religious leaders say, hey, he's claiming to be king, right? And what's Pilate's response? He's got to investigate that. He's got to interrogate Jesus. And he turns and says, "Are you the King of the Jews?" So that's the lead up and the context within which Pilate utters the first of several of his famous phrases. So now, how does Jesus respond to this? Okay. Now again, all right, we got to put ourselves in the place of Pilate. Here you've got the Jewish religious leaders claiming Jesus is claiming to be king, right? Well, when Pilate turns to Jesus and says, "Are you the King of the Jews?" what is Pilate looking at? He's looking at Jesus, right? But Jesus, he doesn't look like a king. He's not wearing royal robes. He doesn't have a crown on his head. He's not carrying a scepter. He doesn't have all of his attendants around him, right? So when you look at this guy that the Jewish religious leaders are claiming that he's a king, right? and you look at this guy, he doesn't look very kingly to you if you're Pilate. But nevertheless, okay, now finally we have a charge claiming to be king. So Pilate's got to act on that charge. He's got to interrogate Jesus. Are you the king of the Jews? Now, what's Jesus' response? Okay, this is where Jesus says, you say so, but my kingdom is not of this world. If it was of this world, my subjects would be fighting for me. Okay, so when Pilate asked for the first time, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Now, let's consider for a second what Jesus might be trying to intimate to Pilate and how Pilate might be hearing this. So again, Pilate, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus, my kingdom is not of this world. In essence, what he's trying to intimate to Pilate is, when he says, my kingdom is not of this world, basically he's intimating he is a king. But he's saying, look, Pilate, in essence, he's saying, look, Pilate, even though I'm a king, and even though I have a kingdom, it's really nothing for you to worry about, because my kingdom is not of this world. I'm not setting up an earthly kingdom to overthrow Caesar, okay, which is what you're probably worried about. That's not what's going on here, okay? My kingship and my kingdom is not earthly. Therefore, it's not a threat to Caesar, okay? My kingship and it's not of this world. So he's trying to intimate to Pilate. He's not lying and saying, well, I'm not a king, but he's saying, look, it's something that you don't have to worry about, okay? They're trying to present me and my kingdom as something that you have to worry about because it's going to overthrow Caesar. Jesus is, in essence, is saying, Pilate, that's not the case. That's not the kind of kingdom I have. And because of that, you don't have to worry that I'm going to do what they're claiming I'm going to do. All right? And then Jesus follows this up, the famous phrase, my kingdom is not of this world. Jesus then tacks on a second phrase. He says, I have come to bear witness to the truth. And this is where we get Pilate's second famous response, his second famous phrase. The first one, are you the king of the Jews? Okay. Here's the second one. When Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world, I came to bear witness to the truth, that's when Pilate utters the famous phrase, what is truth? Now, let me hit the pause button here, and let's talk about two aspects of this, okay? Notice something very subtle here. When Pilate asks, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus responds, and his response has two aspects, right? My kingdom is not of this world. I have come to bear witness to the truth. In essence, in almost one breath, he talks about his kingdom and the truth. And he's saying that kind of in one breath. And he's linking his kingdom with the truth. And he's linking the truth, not a truth, the truth with his kingdom. Because he utters the word my kingdom and truth. See what I'm saying here? He utters the word my kingdom and truth in the same breath. Therefore, in essence, linking them. So, where can you find the truth, the objective truth? In my kingdom. Very interesting, isn't it? All right. Now, that goes completely over Pilate's head, because Pilate then utters his phrase, what is truth? Now, here's the second thing we want to consider in this bit of this dialogue, because obviously we weren't there in 33 AD. So when Pilate utters the phrase, what is truth, we can't see his facial expression. We can't hear the tone of his voice. So over the centuries, there's always been speculation. In what vein did Pilate utter that phrase, what is truth? Was it in the vein of a legitimate question, where Pilate is legitimately asking, Jesus, what is truth? And he's expecting Jesus to answer. So what was it uttered as a legitimate question? Or was it uttered kind of sarcastically? Yeah, sort of like, yeah, what is truth? Whatever. Or was it uttered dismissively? Okay, there is no such thing as truth. So because we weren't there, we can't really get a good idea of what vein Pilate uttered this phrase. Okay, but we can get a little bit of a clue. We can get a little bit of a clue by what Pilate does right after he utters this phrase. Because Scripture records when Pilate utters the phrase, what is truth, he gets up and walks away. Now, the thinking has always been that if this was a legitimate question by Pilate, and he wants a legitimate answer because he really wants to know, if that was the case, he wouldn't have walked away. He would have stayed there awaiting Jesus' answer. The thinking has always been, if you see where I'm going here, the thinking has always been that since he didn't stay there, he walked away, it was not a legitimate question. It was more of a sarcastic, dismissive question. Now, again, we'll never know, but trying to kind of decide, was it legit or was it sarcastic and dismissive, theologians and scholars have tended to point to the fact of, well, what did he do right after he asked a question? Did he wait around for an answer or did he not? And he did not. So let's hit the play button again, okay? So now, Pilate then, okay, after this, he renders his first verdict. He tells the Jewish religious leaders and the people, look, I find no charge against this man. I think this man is innocent. All right? So Pilate publicly states he thinks this guy is innocent at this point. All right? Now, let me hit a quick pause button. All right? We got to ask the question, and we'll answer it by the time we get to the end of the Roman trials. This is the first of several times, like I indicated early on, Pilate publicly declares Jesus as being innocent. If that's the case, how do we go from Pilate believing Jesus is innocent to Pilate condemning him to death? What changed and what made Pilate change? Now, there's an obvious answer to that question, and there's a not so obvious answer to that question. And we'll get to both of them as we go along. But let's plant that question in our minds at this point. Pilate, for the first of several times, says, my verdict, innocent. Well, if that's the case, Pilate, why do you wind up condemning him? Because if you think he's innocent, what you're condemning is an innocent man. What got you to that point? So let's plant that question in our mind and we'll answer it as we go along, okay? That is the end of the first Roman trial, with Pilate declaring Jesus as innocent. Now, in the background, while all of this initial back and forth is going on, right, you've got the Jewish religious leaders. Now remember, they think this is going to be a simple case of we're going to parade Jesus over to Pilate and he's going to sign off on a death penalty. Okay, and we'll get this guy executed. He'll be out of our hair. It's proving to be a little bit more difficult than the Jewish religious leaders thought. So on the one hand, you can see how they're thinking, okay, this is not going as easily as we thought. This is not going according to plan. Okay, we think this was going to be just a formality, and now we've got Pilate saying he's innocent. All right, so things are very quickly going off the rails. And then you've also got a crowd that's gathering, right? So there's a certain amount of agitation going on here, right? Now, the reason I mention that is let's go back to something we said at the beginning when we provided our context. During the feast, Pilate takes up temporary residence because there's all kinds of people coming into Jerusalem and he wants to keep the peace. If you're Pilate and you're sensing a little tension in the air, a little agitation, you've got to be saying to yourself at this point, okay, I think this guy's innocent. I've declared him as innocent. But there's this tension and agitation kind of growing under the surface. And I don't want this to increase to the point where it might become a riot, and then my job is going to be on the line. So if you're Pilate, you're keeping your finger on the pulse of this growing agitation and tension, okay? Because the Jewish religious leaders, in not getting what they're after, now are starting to stir up the crowd. And there's another irony. One of the charges, remember, he's going around stirring up the people. Now what are the Jewish religious leaders doing? They're starting to stir up the people to get them on their side, to put more pressure on Pilate to move off of this guy has committed no crime, he's innocent. So you've got all of this stuff swirling around this three-part exchange between Pilate, the Jewish religious leaders, and Jesus in the middle of them, okay? Now, at some point, the Jewish religious leaders had indicated that, when Jesus was going around the countryside, stirring up the people, telling them not to pay taxes, claiming to be king, right? One of the places he was going was Galilee. Now, Galilee, Herod was over Galilee. He was over that region. So when Pilate hears, oh, Galilee, now he thinks to himself, okay, here's my second escape clause. Remember the first escape clause? Well, if you have a law that he's broken, you deal with him. Here's Pilate's second escape clause. He hears Galilee, he thinks Herod, and he says, I'll send him to Herod, okay? That's how I'll wash my hands of this Jesus situation. I'll put Jesus in Herod's lap and have him deal with these guys, right? So that's exactly what Pilate does. Like I said, he didn't become governor and procurator of this region by being stupid, right? He may have been weak-willed, but he's very shrewd. So he sends the contingent, he sends the Jewish religious leaders with Jesus in tow, he sends them to Herod, okay? Now, Herod is not in Galilee because Galilee's in the north, all right? Herod is taking up temporary residence in Jerusalem as well during this Passover feast, right? So they send the contingent with Jesus in tow to Herod, right? So now the Jewish religious leaders arrive at Herod's doorstep, right? Okay? And Herod, this doesn't go well at all. If the initial Roman trial in front of Pilate didn't go well, which it didn't, then this second Roman trial in front of Herod, that's going to go even worse. Because Herod had always had a little fascination with Jesus, because he had heard all the miracles he was doing, right? And when they bring this same Jesus to Herod, right, Herod is thinking, this is great, okay? This miracle man that I've been hearing about, okay, performing all these miracles, now he's been brought to my doorstep. So Herod sees this as an opportunity for Jesus to perform a miracle in front of him, right? So the Jewish religious leaders bring Jesus to Herod, all right? Herod doesn't care about any crimes he may or may not have committed. He wants Jesus to perform a miracle. He wants him to little act, right? Well, obviously Jesus doesn't go for it, right? And Herod gets exasperated and says, take this guy away from me, right? Now, you're the Jewish religious leaders. Roman trial number 1 in front of Pilate, okay? Did not go well. Pilate says he's innocent. Roman trial number 2 in front of Herod. Herod doesn't even care, right? He wants Jesus to perform a miracle. He doesn't, so he sends him off, right? So if you're the Jewish religious leaders, you are getting very nervous. because what you thought was going to be a formality, now at this point, it looks like you're not going to even get this done, okay? You're not even going to be able to get him executed. So things are completely falling apart at this point, you're thinking, if you're a Jewish religious leader. This thing is really going sideways. It's really going off the rails. So now, the Jewish religious leaders, the contingent with Jesus now, they've got to trek back from Herod's place back to Pilate's place. So if you visualize it, here comes that contingent with Jesus in tow, right? They're coming back from Herod's place to Pilate. And they're thinking, oh man, this is not going well at all. We're running out of time here. We got to get this guy killed, and we're worse off than when we started. If you're Pilate, can you imagine? You think you've washed your hands of this Jesus situation, right? You've sent them to Herod. You figure you're never going to see Jesus again, right? Can you imagine Pilate's dismay when he's kind of patting himself on the back, thinking he got out of the situation, and he's maybe looking out his window of his temporary residence, and he sees the contingent coming back with Jesus? Can you imagine Pilate's dismay? If you're Pilate, you're thinking, well, I thought I got rid of this guy. I thought I got myself out of this situation. Now they're coming back. Oh, my goodness, right? So they're coming back, and they arrive back at Pilate's doorstep, and here starts Roman trial number 3, right? Now, as they arrive back at Pilate's doorstep, where are we? Okay. Pilate, at this point, believes Jesus to be innocent, and he has said that, right? So here they come back again, right? And now the Jewish religious leaders, now they're very nervous. Things are going sideways. They're stirring up the people. The tension and the agitation in the air is growing. You're Pilate, you're keeping your finger on the pulse of that because you don't want a riot, because that's one of your main job descriptions. Keep the peace, keep the Pax Romana, right? So if you're Pilate and you see them coming back, you're already thinking, okay, I've got to come up with escape clause number 3. Remember, escape clause number 1? Oh, if you broke your law, you deal with them. Escape clause number 2? Oh, Galilee? That's Herod territory. I'll send them to Herod. So neither of those worked, right? Now you got to think escape clause number 3. So if you're Pilate, you're saying, wait a second now. Wait a second. You know, at Passover time, the Jewish people, they have kind of a ritual where they will have Rome, me, release one of the prisoners in commemoration of them being released from Egypt. That was part of the whole Passover feast, right? They were released from the prison of Egypt, so to speak. So one of the aspects of the Passover celebration was they would have a criminal released, right? So Pilate's thinking, oh, I can use this kind of ceremony or ritual they have. I can use that against them. Okay. I'm going to, and think of Pilate, right? He's going to say, okay, I can put an actual criminal next to Jesus, who he thinks is not a criminal. And I'm going to say, okay, which one do you want to be released, right? But this can't be any criminal. I've got to put the vilest criminal next to Jesus. So when I posed a question to the Jewish religious leaders, which one do you want released? The Jewish religious leaders are going to be looking at Jesus, and they're going to be looking at this vile criminal. And if you're Pilate, you're thinking, there's no way they're going to want this vile criminal released. So that will force them to release Jesus, and Pilate will be out of the Jesus situation. You see what I'm saying? Okay? So Pilate is searching, and he's saying, okay, I got to have the vilest criminal I can come up with. And he finds him. And we know who he is, Barabbas. Now, here's another irony, right? Barabbas is in prison because he is a criminal. Jesus is not. And what crime has Barabbas committed? He has committed insurrection. He has committed treason. He was stirring up the people to overthrow Rome. So he was actually doing what they claimed Jesus was doing. The irony, okay? Here's another irony. We know Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Son of his heavenly Father, right? The name Barabbas comes from Bar Abbas. Bar means son of, Abbas comes from Abba, Father. So the name Barabbas means son of the Father. So you've got I'll use this term, you've got the fake son of the Father next to the real son of the Father. You've got a guy that's actually a criminal next to a guy that's not a criminal. You've got a guy that's actually committed insurrection and treason next to a guy that they're claiming has but hasn't. The irony there. So back here. So Pilate says, okay, I'm gonna bring out Barabbas. I'm gonna set him next to Jesus. And there's no way they're gonna release Barabbas, okay? So they've got to release Jesus and I'll be out of the situation. I won't have to kill who I think is an innocent man. Well, you think Pilate was dismayed when they saw the contingent coming back from Herod's? You can imagine. He's going to go from dismay to shock now, because we know the story. Who do they pick? They say, give us Barabbas. They want this vile criminal released and Jesus executed. Whereas Pilate figured, okay, they'll release Jesus and they'll execute Barabbas, all right? So you can imagine, Pilate now has gone from dismay to utter shock because he thinks there's no way they're going to release Barabbas. And that's exactly what they want to do. Give us Barabbas, all right? Now, you're Pilate, okay? You're thinking to yourself, all right, this, the Jewish religious leaders have been thinking, this is not going according to plan. Well, if you're Pilate, ironically, you're thinking the same thing for a different reason. This is not going to plan, okay? I think this guy's innocent. I'm trying to get him released. I'm trying to get out of from under this situation, and I just can't do it, okay? I thought I had one escape clause that didn't work. I thought I had a second escape clause that didn't work. I figured I had the escape clause of all escape clauses, okay? Give them a choice between a real criminal and not, and they'll be forced to release Jesus, and that doesn't work. So, again, get the scene, all right? They said, give us Barabbas, all right? Now, if you're Pilate, okay, how do you respond to this, okay? Because, again, Pilate is keeping his finger on the growing tension and agitation, because the Jewish religious leaders have been stirring up the people, all right? Stirring them up, right? And now, during all of this back and forth that we've been talking about this episode, the tension and the agitation has been growing and growing and growing. And if you're Pilate, you're getting closer and closer to a potential riot, which you can't have, right? That's why you're taking up temporary residence. That's why you have extra soldiers to keep the peace, all right? So if you're Pilate, you're nervously, you're looking at the Jewish religious leaders, you're looking at Jesus, you're nervously eyeing the crowd, right? So he's really worried at this point, right? So you're Pilate, okay. You still think Jesus is innocent at this point. So you say, okay, I've got to come up with escape clause number 4, right? Because we're keeping track of these, right? So Pilate says, okay, let's see, what can I do to get out of this? Because I got to think quick, because this agitation is growing. Every minute that goes by, we're getting 1 minute closer to a riot, all right? So Pilate, think quick. Pilate says, oh, I've got it. What I'll do is now I'll invoke one of our customs. When the Jewish customs was to release a prisoner, well, Romans, what they would do, oftentimes before an individual would be crucified, is he would be scourged first, okay? And when we talk about the scourging, which we'll do next episode, we'll talk about the reasons for that. So oftentimes a scourging would precede a crucifixion. So Pilate says, okay, think quick, think quick. Okay, I've got it. This is escape clause number 4. Pilate's thinking to himself, okay, if I have him scourged, now keep in mind, if you're Pilate, you still think this guy's innocent. So when you're thinking to yourself, if I have this man scourged, really what you're thinking is, if I have this innocent man scourged, because you think he's innocent, right? If I have him scourged, and if I have him really scourged, okay, and then I present him to the people, and he's just a bloody mess, that will satisfy their bloodlust, so to speak. And that will be good enough. And they'll be satisfied with that. And then they'll let Jesus off the hook, and I won't have to execute him. Okay? Because the question is, well, if Pilate really believes Jesus is innocent, why does he have an innocent person scourged? Now we know that was one of his escape clauses. If I have him scourged badly enough, that will satisfy them. They'll drop the death penalty charge, and everybody will leave and go their own way. Okay? Well, we know that Pilate does have him scourged. And we know after scourging, he does present Jesus to the crowd. And when he presents Jesus to the crowd, that's the third famous phrase of Pilate, right? Phrase 1, are you the king of the Jews? Phrase 2, what is truth? When he presents Jesus to the Jewish religious and the crowd, thoroughly scourged and a bloody mess, that's when he utters his third famous phrase, ecce homo, behold the man. In essence saying, look guys, come on. You know, this guy's been scourged to within an inch of his life. Take a look at him. Isn't that enough? And we know, sadly, it wasn't enough. So that's where Roman trial 3 ends, because at this point, Pilate has him scourged, right? And we'll talk about the scourging and the crucifixion and the burial next episode. So again, what we did today is we picked up the narrative and we went through the 3 Roman trials. The trial before Pilate, the trial, in essence, before Herod, and then the trial before Pilate again, right? And now it's to the point where Pilate figures, if I have him scourged and present him to the crowd and they take a look at him, that'll be enough and we'll be done with this situation, okay? And obviously it wasn't. So it's a 53-minute mark. That's where we'll leave this episode. We'll call it Good Friday Part 1. Next episode, Good Friday Part 2, we'll pick up with the scourging, some background on that. We'll pick up with the crucifixion, some background on that, and then the burial, some background on that. That will complete our 2-episode treatment of Good Friday. And then again, our final episode of this Lenten series will be a 1-episode treatment of Holy Thursday. So with that, as always, thank you for supporting this series. Thank you for supporting Fresh Catholic. And Good Friday Part 2 coming right up. Take care, everybody. God bless.